iconic cowboy actor Roy Rogers is on the auction block at Christie's through today.
It is, and it's kind of sad for the family to let it go, but we only hold history for a short time.
It was once the happiest place for fans of the Wild West, a museum packed with boots, saddles, and the golden legacy of America's favorite cowboy. But now, the Roy Rogers Museum is gone, its doors shut, its treasures scattered, and fans everywhere left wondering why. How does a shrine to a national icon just disappear? Was it money, fading fame, or something deeper? This is the untold story behind the closure of the Roy Rogers Museum. And the answer might be sadder than you expect. The boy who would become Roy. Before the white Stetson, before the silver spurs and movie screens, he was just a kid named Leonard Franklin Sly. Born on November 5, 1911 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Leonard's life began in a tent pitched on 2nd Street, where Riverfront Stadium would one day stand. It was not a glamorous start. It was muddy, cold, and fragile. His father, Andy Sly, hated city life and his job so much that he and his brother built a makeshift houseboat out of salvaged lumber, determined to give their families a chance at something freer, something wilder. In July 1912, the Slys floated north on the Ohio River toward Portsmouth, their little boat creaking against the current. The dream was land and independence, but after the flood of 1913, they dragged that same houseboat onto dry land and kept living in it. It wasn't a mansion. It was survival. And it shaped young Leonard in ways no one could have predicted. By 1919, they bought a farm in Duck Run, just north of Portsmouth. There, life was a mix of hardship and discovery. Leonard learned to ride on a horse his father brought home one weekend. That horse, a simple gift, turned into a seed of destiny. He learned to yodel with his mother across the fields as a kind of rustic intercom system. It was both play and connection. Square dances on Saturday nights gave Leonard his first taste of entertaining others. He sang, played mandolin, and called dances while neighbors stomped the barn floor in rhythm. His early education was scattered. He attended school in McDermott, Ohio, for a time, then dropped out after the family returned to Cincinnati. He tried night school while working in a shoe factory with his father, but exhaustion made studying impossible. He eventually gave up on formal education entirely. But Leonard wasn't giving up on life. He was just getting started. By the late 1920s, the Great Depression was looming, and jobs were evaporating. Leonard's sister Mary had already moved to California, and the golden promise of the West drew him in. He packed into a 1923 Dodge with his father and headed to Los Angeles. They didn't stay long, but Leonard returned on his own a few months later. He bounced from job to job, peach picker, gravel truck driver, migrant worker, anything that kept food on the table. Then came the spark that would change everything. His sister nudged him into auditioning for a local radio show called Midnight Frolic. It was out of character. Leonard was shy, but he showed up in a Western shirt stitched by Mary, strummed his guitar, sang, yodeled, and won the crowd. Soon after, he joined the Rocky Mountaineers, a country group looking for a new sound. It wasn't easy. Band members came and went. Gigs dried up. Leonard tried different groups, different names, even different instruments, but something always brought him back to the stage. In 1933, he reconnected with Bob Nolan and Tim Spencer to form what would become the Sons of the Pioneers. They were rough, unpolished, and hungry, but their harmonies were clean, their spirit genuine, and they rehearsed like it was the only thing keeping them alive. A year later, they had a new member, fiddle player Hugh Farr, and a new name. A radio announcer dubbed them the Sons of the Pioneers, and it stuck. They signed with Decca Records and recorded hits like Tumbling Tumbleweeds and Cool Water. The group exploded onto the national scene. What started in dusty living rooms became a syndicated radio phenomenon. Leonard Sly was now a name in country music, but a bigger transformation was coming. In 1938, Cowboy star Gene Autry had a contract dispute, and Republic Pictures needed a new singing cowboy. They held auditions across the West. Leonard auditioned and won. The studio renamed him Roy Rogers, a nod to Will Rogers, and handed him a starring role in Under Western Stars. That film launched Roy Rogers into American stardom. He wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a movie hero, galloping across Technicolor plains with a sidearm on his hip and a song on his lips. His horse Trigger became a star in his own right. Children lined up for autographs. Merchandise rolled out across the country. Roy was everywhere: comics, toys, radio, and later, television. He filmed over 100 westerns, most of them B-movies, but they had something that stuck: morality, humor, action, and a sense of wonder. He was the good guy in white, literally and figuratively. He kissed babies, helped orphans, and smiled at danger. He embodied the values of loyalty, honesty, and bravery in a time when the country desperately needed heroes. But Roy Rogers was not just a brand. He was a builder. He negotiated merchandising rights into his contract, a savvy move that would make him one of the highest-earning entertainers of his time. He understood the power of his image and protected it carefully. He teamed up with Dale Evans, his co-star and future wife, and together they built not just a media empire, but a cultural beacon. The Roy Rogers Museum was not an afterthought. It was part of the plan. A place to preserve the myth and the man. But before that museum ever opened its doors, Roy had to live a life big enough to fill it. How did something built on so much love and legacy fall so far? Rise of a Western legend and the birth of a museum. By the time the 1940s rolled around, Roy Rogers was more than just a cowboy on the silver screen. He was a cultural institution. As the star of dozens of westerns, and with a voice that drew both cheers and tears, he had captured America's imagination. But the foundation of that legacy was not just his acting or music. It was the way he lived and what he represented. For many Americans, Roy Rogers wasn't a character. He was the embodiment of the values they aspired to. His popularity was explosive. He became the first Western star to truly understand the power of cross-media influence. Roy was not just appearing in films, he was on radios, in comic strips, singing on records, and showing up in children's dreams. He made over 100 movies, many featuring his golden Palomino horse, Trigger, and trusty German shepherd, Bullet. These animals weren't props. They were as much a part of Roy's identity as his cowboy hat and guitar. Trigger became one of the most beloved horses in American history. He performed tricks, had his own fan mail, and even toured with Roy. Trigger was advertised as the smartest horse in the movies, and fans believed it. When Trigger passed away in 1965, Roy had him preserved through taxidermy, ensuring that the bond they shared would live on beyond death. This wasn't about vanity. It was about storytelling, legacy, and preserving a personal history that fans had made their own. It was clear that Roy Rogers was not just building a brand, he was building a mythology. As Roy's fame grew, so did his business acumen. He partnered with Dale Evans, his on-screen co-star and real-life partner. Dale wasn't just a compliment to Roy's persona. She was a force of her own. A talented singer, actress, and advocate, she brought a sense of grounded faith and compassion to their shared brand. Together, They raised a large family that included both biological and adopted children. They experienced great personal tragedy, including the death of their daughter Robin, who had Down syndrome, but turned their grief into advocacy and public service. The couple were known for their deep Christian values. They gave back to their community, supported children's charities, and promoted adoption. Their theme song, Happy Trails, which Dale wrote, was not just a closing jingle, it was a blessing. A message that even in the roughest of times, there was joy to be found on the trail ahead. The 1950s brought television into the Rogers empire. The Roy Rogers Show aired from 1951 to 1957, bringing his Western adventures into living rooms across the country. With Dale by his side and their animal companions included in the credits, the show reinforced their image as America's first family of the frontier. Roy played himself, a benevolent sheriff and rancher, always ready to lend a hand or ride to the rescue. Dale was his partner in every sense, not just a damsel, but an equal in wit and will. Merchandise followed. Roy's face was everywhere on lunchboxes, toy guns, cowboy hats, bed sheets, comic books, and cereal boxes. His comic book series ran for over a decade, and his licensing revenue rivaled Walt Disney's. At the height of his career, Roy Rogers wasn't just a performer. He was a one-man entertainment ecosystem. And yet, with all the money and fame, Roy Rogers remained remarkably grounded. He refused to let Hollywood reshape him. He maintained his modest lifestyle, his values, and his focus on his family and fans. He was, as many noted, the same man in person as he was on screen. So when Roy Rogers decided to create a museum, it wasn't a vanity project, it was a gift. The Roy Rogers Dale Evans Museum opened in Apple Valley, California in 1967. It was built to house the staggering collection of memorabilia the couple had amassed during their decades in the entertainment industry. But more than that, it was meant to be a place of gratitude. Roy didn't build the museum for himself. He built it for the fans. Inside the museum, visitors could see Trigger posed in a lifelike stance. Bullet stood nearby. Nellie Bell, the Jeep from the TV show, was also on display. But maintaining a museum is no small feat, and as time passed, trouble loomed ahead. By the late 1990s, Roy Rogers was in his 80s and beginning to slow down. He made fewer public appearances, but his love for the fans never faded. Even in his final years, he would show up at the museum, sometimes unannounced, wearing his classic white hat and bolo tie. Visitors were often stunned to find themselves face-to-face with the cowboy of their childhoods. He would shake hands, pose for photos, and thank them sincerely for keeping the spirit of the West alive. When Roy passed away in 1998, the museum became even more sacred to his admirers. His passing was a national moment of mourning. Tributes poured in from celebrities, politicians, and longtime fans. President Bill Clinton publicly praised Roy's impact on American values, calling him a symbol of kindness and courage. It seemed the museum would now stand as a permanent memorial to everything he had built. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to unravel. Attendance began to drop. As the generation that grew up with Roy Rogers aged, fewer young visitors were making the journey to Apple Valley. Despite efforts to modernize the exhibits and create more interactive experiences, the museum felt increasingly like a relic of a different time. Pop culture had moved on, Westerns were no longer mainstream, and for many, the name Roy Rogers evoked nostalgia, but not urgency. The museum's operating costs continued to climb. Maintenance, insurance, staffing, and upkeep of the exhibits required more than just passion. It required sustainable revenue. And even though the Rogers family remained deeply involved, especially Roy's son Dusty, they couldn't reverse the trend. In 2003, the museum was moved to Branson, Missouri, in hopes of revitalizing its reach. Branson, with its tourism-driven economy and affinity for old-fashioned entertainment, seemed like the perfect home. For a while, it worked. Visitor numbers improved. But the challenges never really went away. The truth was harsh. The museum could not survive on legacy alone. Roy had always been practical. Before his death, he told his children that if the museum ever became a financial burden, they should not feel guilty about closing it. He understood that times change, and holding on to a dream at all costs can lead to heartbreak. That moment came in 2009. The decision was painful but necessary. The museum was closed, and its contents prepared for auction. Everything from Trigger's saddle to Roy's first guitar would be sold. Fans were devastated. The museum had been more than a building. It had been a connection, a sanctuary, a place where memory lived in full color. The auction, held by Christie's, was emotional. Hundreds of artifacts went to private collectors, institutions, and fans who saw the sale not as a loss, but as a way to preserve a piece of Roy's story. Trigger was purchased by RFD-TV's owner, Patrick Gotch, who ensured the horse would remain on public display. The final auction moment came with a hush. As Dale Evans's horse and Trigger's stunt double were sold, someone in the crowd began to sing Happy Trails. Slowly, the entire room joined in. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a goodbye. Roy Rogers's museum may have closed its doors, but it never truly disappeared. Pieces of it live on in homes, in memories, and in the values Roy stood for. He was more than a cowboy. He was a reminder that character, family, and faith are worth more than fame. And though the trail may have ended in Branson, the spirit of Roy Rogers rides on. What many people never saw was the emotional weight the closure carried for the Rogers family. For Dusty Rogers, who had grown up in the glow of his father's fame and later worked as the museum's curator, the decision was not just financial, it was personal. He had walked those museum floors hundreds of times, talked with fans, shared stories, and kept the legacy alive in real time. Watching the museum fall silent was like saying goodbye to his father all over again. Some of the most heart-wrenching decisions came down to what would happen to Trigger, Bullet, and the custom artifacts Roy had cherished for decades. Dusty had hoped to keep them all together, perhaps preserved in another institution, but ultimately, the auction scattered those memories far and wide. While many of the items were sold to admirers who would cherish them, the sense of unity and completeness the museum offered could never be recreated. But the Rogers family found solace in the fact that the spirit of Roy Rogers lived on in places they could not control. Old Western films saw a resurgence in DVD sales. Streaming platforms began adding vintage shows, including The Roy Rogers Show, introducing his heroism to a new generation of viewers. Fan conventions, retro festivals, and cowboy reenactments continued to honor his legacy. It became clear that while a building might close, a legend does not vanish so easily. There were even attempts by passionate fans to create a new home for the museum's contents. Grassroots campaigns circulated online, proposing partnerships with libraries, schools, or cultural centers. Some wanted to start a traveling exhibit, bringing Roy's legacy on the road, just like the rodeos he used to headline. While those plans never fully materialized, they underscored the depth of affection people still held for him. Meanwhile, educators and historians began using Roy Rogers as a case study in American culture. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was an archetype, a media-savvy entertainer who bridged radio, film, and television with ease. College courses on media history and cultural mythology often cite Roy Rogers as one of the earliest examples of brand integration across platforms. From his voice to his wardrobe, from Trigger to Nellie Bell, everything Roy touched became part of the broader American imagination. Even within faith communities, Roy remained a beloved figure. Churches that had once invited Roy and Dale to speak still played clips from their interviews. Their emphasis on family values, kindness, and optimism found new resonance in a cynical era. Faith-based blogs, tribute concerts, and Sunday school lessons kept their message alive. In Apple Valley, California, where Roy and Dale had made their home, local residents continued to honor their memory with annual events and dedications. Street names bore the Rogers name. Public buildings had plaques commemorating their contributions to children's charities and community services. And despite the museum's closure, the town itself felt like a living tribute. For all the pain of the museum's end, it also marked a powerful transition. It signaled that Roy Rogers had transcended the need for a physical space. He had become something larger. His songs, his shows, his values, and his voice remained etched in the hearts of millions. And perhaps, in a way, the closing of the museum brought people closer to what Roy truly stood for. Not the artifacts, not the display cases, but the memories, the impact, the feeling of safety, hope, and honor that came every time he appeared on screen. Because in the end, it wasn't just a museum that closed. It was a chapter in American history that turned its final page. But the book is still being read. Why the Museum Fell Silent. The Roy Rogers Dale Evans Museum was never meant to be a business. It was built as a love letter, a tribute to a time when cowboys didn't just entertain, they inspired. But as the decades passed, even the most sacred halls are not immune to the passage of time. By the early 2000s, the museum was running into a storm that no six-shooter could fend off. Dwindling attendance, rising costs, and a generational shift in interest. For years, the museum served as a place where fans from across the country could come face to face with their childhood heroes. The scent of polished leather, the soft lighting over Trigger's display, the worn pages of Roy's comic books behind glass, every detail was a portal to a golden past. But nostalgia, for all its power, could not pay the bills. The move from California to Branson, Missouri in 2003 was intended as a fresh start. Branson had a thriving tourist industry, especially with older visitors and families who still cherished classic Americana, and, for a while, it seemed like the right call. New visitors came, media coverage returned, Roy's name was alive again. But the spark was temporary. By 2007, the cracks were starting to show. Attendance began to slip again. Not catastrophically, but steadily. The audiences were aging, and few new fans were replacing them. The children who had once idolized Roy Rogers were now grandparents. Their grandkids, raised on superheroes and video games, did not feel the same emotional pull toward cowboy hats and six-string guitars. Roy Rogers Jr., known as Dusty, had taken the mantle of curator and caretaker. He tried everything to breathe life back into the museum. Special exhibitions, promotional tie-ins, even touring artifacts to other cities. But it was like trying to stop a tide with your hands. Then came the recession of 2008. Tourism numbers fell across the country. Even Branson, a town built on nostalgia and music halls, saw steep declines. The museum was no exception. Monthly expenses began to outweigh income. Maintenance for the taxidermied animals alone was thousands of dollars a year. Air conditioning, preservation, staffing, insurance, all of it added up to an unsustainable reality. Dusty faced the hard truth. The museum was not just fading, it was bleeding. He remembered his father's words. Roy had been clear. If the museum ever became a financial burden, it was to be closed. He did not want his legacy to be propped up artificially. He wanted it to thrive or rest. So in late 2009, Dusty and the family made the difficult decision. The museum would shut its doors. It would not relocate. It would not rebrand. It would quietly end its journey, just as Roy had predicted. What followed was one of the most emotional and unforgettable auctions in American pop culture history. The auction at Christie's in July 2010 was not just a sale. It was a final farewell. More than 300 items were up for bid, each with its own story, its own place in Roy and Dale's world. Fans and collectors from around the country showed up, not with the goal of buying history, but of preserving it. To hold a piece of Roy Rogers was to hold a piece of their own childhoods, of America itself. Trigger, Roy's beloved golden palomino, was the crown jewel. Stuffed and displayed since 1965, the horse stood proud in the museum for decades, symbolizing loyalty, speed, and strength. Bidding was fierce. It finally went to Patrick Gotch, founder of RFD-TV, for $266,500. Gotch didn't want Trigger hidden in a private collection. He wanted him on display, where the public could continue to see and honor him. He succeeded. Trigger now stands at the RFD-TV headquarters in Nebraska, still watched over by those who remember him. Bullet, Roy's German Shepherd, also preserved through taxidermy, was sold for $35,000. Dale Evans's horse Buttermilk was purchased for $25,000. And even Nellie Bell, the museum's famous Willie's Jeep from the television series, went for $116,500. These weren't just props. They were characters in a story that millions had grown up with. The sale was deeply personal for the Rogers family. Dusty admitted he cried the night before the auction, knowing the next day they'd be saying goodbye to everything his parents had built. His hope was that the items would go to good homes, to people who understood their value. And they did. The crowd was respectful. At the end, when the last item was sold, someone softly began to sing "Happy Trails." One voice turned into dozens, then hundreds. It wasn't a performance. It was a eulogy. The museum's closing sparked a national conversation about legacy and cultural memory. How do we preserve the icons of the past in a world so fixated on the future? Why do we forget the people who shaped us once they are no longer trending? Articles ran in the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times, all lamenting the end of the Roy Rogers Museum and questioning what it meant for American nostalgia. What most people didn't know was how much Roy had prepared for this. Long before his passing, he told his children not to mourn if the museum ever had to close. He believed that every generation writes its own stories, and holding on too tightly to the past can sometimes keep you from living the present. But he also believed in honoring what came before. The key, he said, was to remember the message. Roy and Dale's message was always about family, honesty, faith, and grit. Their lives, on and off screen, were dedicated to lifting others up. They adopted children, raised money for disabled youth, worked with charities, and always made time for their fans. In a business known for ego, Roy was known for humility. The closure of the museum did not diminish that legacy. If anything, it made people appreciate it more. In the years that followed the auction, fans continued to celebrate Roy's memory in creative ways. Online forums were filled with photographs of Roy and Trigger, letters shared by those who had met him, and videos of families singing Happy Trails together. Cowboy reenactment groups began hosting annual Roy Rogers tribute days. Western festivals revived his films, and libraries held Roy Rogers reading hours for kids. The town of Apple Valley, where Roy and Dale had spent their final years, became something of a living memorial. Streets were named after the couple. A statue of Roy on Trigger was erected. The local school district began incorporating Roy's values into student programs, teaching children about respect, courage, and kindness. His values found new soil in the hearts of kids who had never even seen one of his films. But perhaps the most surprising legacy came from an entirely different direction. Academics and film historians began to reevaluate Roy's place in American cinema. For decades, he had been dismissed by critics as a singing cowboy, a B-movie gimmick. But as scholarship grew more sophisticated, a new appreciation for Roy's role in shaping American masculinity and media storytelling emerged. He was now being studied not just as an entertainer, but as a myth-maker. His life was the American dream on horseback. Poor beginnings, relentless hard work, moral clarity, and success earned through character rather than compromise. Even Disney historians acknowledged that Roy's merchandising empire paved the way for characters like Mickey Mouse and Buzz Lightyear. Before action figures were a billion-dollar business, Roy Rogers was already doing it. His face was on everything from puzzles to pocket knives. But unlike so many celebrity brands today, Roy's name actually meant something. It carried weight. Parents trusted him. Kids adored him. This shift in perspective brought a quiet revival of interest in Roy's work. Several streaming platforms acquired rights to air his classic films. Documentaries were produced about the sons of the pioneers. Dale's autobiography, Angel Unaware, about their daughter Robin, experienced renewed interest, especially among special needs advocacy groups. And most meaningfully, Roy's voice recordings of his old radio shows, music, and interviews were remastered and released for a new generation to hear. In one interview, when asked what he hoped his fans would remember about him, he replied simply, "That I tried to do the right thing." The museum may have fallen silent, but that message rang louder than ever. And now, more than a decade later, the Roy Rogers legacy continues to be a point of reference. New generations stumble across his films and are surprised at how simple yet powerful the stories are. Parents play Happy Trails for their kids during road trips. Old lunchboxes show up in antique stores, reminding shoppers of a time when heroes rode horses and always told the truth. Maybe the world changed too fast for the museum to keep up. Maybe the internet, with all its noise, drowned out the quiet dignity of men like Roy Rogers. But dignity has a way of coming back around. And what if this isn't the end of the trail? What if somewhere, someone is already working on a digital museum, a documentary series, or a revival film? What if Roy's values are exactly what the modern world needs to rediscover? Because for every fan who walked through the museum doors, who touched the brim of a cowboy hat in reverence, who looked up at Trigger's glass eyes and remembered a simpler time, Roy Rogers never really left. He just rode ahead. The museum may be gone, but the man behind it lives on in the stories we tell, the values we pass down, and the songs we still hum under our breath. Roy Rogers wasn't just a cowboy on the screen. He was the trailblazer of a simpler, more honest kind of heroism. And while the doors of his museum may have closed, the legacy he built rides on, quietly, in the hearts of those who still believe in happy trails and doing the right thing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who remembers. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What's your favorite Roy Rogers memory? And always remember, legends don't fade. They echo.